500 days after leaving the big corporate job. I want to talk about, some of the highs and lows of making that big decision 500 days ago. What impact has that had on me? What have been the really good things about leaving the big 1 million salary corporate job, and good and bad. So I'll talk about a couple of these different things. And I think it's important to really understand that this is not necessarily for people who are 50s, 60s, already made that decision and they're in their retirement. I really want to help those people who are much younger, those people who are kind of 30s, getting into their 40s and thinking about what do they want to do for the rest of their lives. And I think there is a much better path that you can choose beyond the default path. And there's a couple of great authors that talk about this pathless path as being the option that we should now consider pursuing. And quite honestly, in a world where AI is fast changing everything, all those people who thought they were in a safe corporate position are suddenly not in that position. So I want to talk about what's happened since 500 days, since leaving that job. And then I want to talk about some of the things that you might want to do to help prepare for when you want to leave the job early, and making sure that that transition from a high paying salary corporate role into a kind of semi-retired, because I don't like the word retired. I don't think that's a kind of true reflection of certainly where I see my life, and for many I know that's not true as well. So how do you move into a kind of semi-retired, what I call a portfolio career? Okay, so first of all, here's the reality of that. So I was doing a big corporate role, working for a large bank, and I've been in that position, that final position, for nearly 6 years, living in Singapore. So doing extremely well, big salary, big bonuses, all the fantastic things you'd expect from a high position group corporate role. I really enjoyed it. It was one of the best experiences of my corporate career. I reached the pinnacle of my career. Probably couldn't go much higher within the profession that I was in. So I was very pleased with what I'd achieved. And I always advise people, and we do this within the community that I serve, which is largely the cybersecurity community, technologists and risk professionals. Do as well as you can in your career, push the limits of what's possible, and achieve the very best that you can from that. Because I still think, even today, with all this talk about building a business, being an entrepreneur, which seems to be all the rage, especially for those younger people, I think it's quite tough doing that, because it takes some time to build a business, build a profile, build your brand, and build an audience for your customers, potential customers. So that's going to take time. So I'm a big advocate of having a corporate job first, and then thinking about what you're going to do on the side, that planning, that building the audience, building your brand. And then you're going to have a much softer landing. So anyway, I'll talk more about that in a second, but let's talk about the realities after 500 days. So 500 days, what are the realities for me? Well, the first thing is, you've got a lot more time back. That is for sure. I didn't just leave the corporate role in Singapore. I actually left the corporate role in Singapore and moved to Australia. I'd already had a house here anyway, and so moved to that house. I did have some time off in between. I spent some time in Bali. I went to an all men's retreat, which was a fantastic experience. If you've never done an all men's retreat, then I'd certainly advise doing that. It was quite a special, it's called a Bali Time Chamber, for anybody who's interested in that. It's an all men's retreat. There's gym stuff there. It's pretty much all carnivore food that you eat, and you meet other like-minded people as well. A lot of entrepreneurs go there as well. So yeah, quite diverse, very young. I was probably one of the oldest people there, but yeah, great experience. So having done that, I had some time. So that immediate jump from the corporate world was this kind of sense of relief, and I really enjoyed that. I've left it behind, and I still had all the usual obligations that you have when you first leave a big corporate role like that, as I move into latter days of my retirement. So having had that experience there, I met with my wife at the end of it. She came over to join me in Bali. We spent a couple of weeks together. So that was just over a month or so in Bali, which was great. Now, obviously, left there, came to come back in Australia where I had a house with my wife, and we moved in to that house, and we've been there now for the last 500 days. So what has happened over that 500 days? Well, I did already have a business that I'd been building called the Cyber Leadership Institute, and you can look online and find it. I'm one of the non-exec directors of that company, but one of the co-founders. So, we've been gradually building that up over the years with an operations team that helps us scale. And now that's, become a source of income, not a huge source of income, but obviously gives you some soft landing. And when you ever do any type of business, you learn about business in general through doing. And for all you budding kind of entrepreneurs out there who are thinking about building other sources of income, and certainly if you're thinking about retiring early before 50, or definitely before 55, then just starting any type of business is going to be really helpful for you, because it just means that you actually learn by doing. There's no amount of books or YouTube channels that you can watch that's going to prepare you for real business. And I coach many people on this. We run master class sessions that run twice a year. We talk about how people can do this transition. Anyway, so having done that, I would say the first 3 months, a bit of a shock to the system, if I'm honest. It was, when you've been used to managing a team of 200 people, you're almost craving that status. And if I'm honest, I kind of overdid it a bit when I came into the business. I was kind of over managing the business. I think it's because I was craving this kind of status that I had, and I was jumping on calls, I was speaking to people, almost trying to keep the rhythm up of what I've been doing in the corporate world, because that had been my identity. But after about 6 months in, that began to relax, and I began to engage less with that and make more of that free time. Don't forget, my wife had also finished her corporate year many years before, and she's into things like meditation and doing holistic well-being things. So she had a bit of free time as well. So it wasn't just a case of just jumping straight back in and keeping myself busy. I wanted to spend more time with her as well. My daughter had also moved over from the UK to Bondi Beach, so she was around. And obviously, whenever friends come over, you can just spend more time with them. So I had to be very ruthless about not just continuing with that mindset, and had to step back a little bit. But the more I pulled back and got used to it, it got a lot easier. And so then I was just thinking about, well, what other sources of income? There was lots of people reaching out to me because of my prior expertise in cybersecurity. So there was speaking opportunities and working with technology vendors, helping them on their journey, doing articles, joint articles with them, helping with some branding, or what you might consider kind of influencer stuff. But a lot of that basically came on the fact that I'd been building a personal brand many years before, probably up to at least 5 years of being intentional. And these are the other things that I talk about a lot is, when you're jumping out of the corporate world, you don't want to be not known out there in the community. You need to be known for whatever that thing is that you want to be known for. This is why people write books. And by the way, if you've never even considered writing a book to become an author, it's a really good way of giving yourself a kind of an authoritative stance in the world. And it's never been easier to self-publish a book. And for all, just a bit of a tip out there, if you are considering doing this, and it's something that I'm going through the process of doing again, because I've co-authored a book, and now I'm doing my fully self-authored book, which should be coming out probably in the next 6 months ago, so look out for that. But there's lots of AI tools that you can use, not necessarily for writing the book, but for prompting you on how you can write the book, asking you the right questions, because ultimately you need to get your story out, and AI is not going to produce the story, that's your story. So you want to help that. A lot of these editors, this has been historical by the way, lots of editors come out and help finish a book, but they're almost just rewriting it into the style that they'd want to write. That's not different with AI. If you can train it on a style that matches your preferred style, then that editor's not required. So anyway, there's lots. I'm going to talk about writing a book on a lot more details. I think that story of how to write a book, how to self-publish, is an interesting one, and you can do that at a fraction of the cost. And arguably, I think you can do a much better job these days. So I've been looking into that quite a lot. The other thing that's been super good, of course, is this sense of being able to focus on my health. And when you're in a corporate role, your stress levels are pretty high. You know, you are constantly in this kind of flight or fight scenario to a degree, because, you know, it's a high stress environment, especially when you're working at that kind of C-suite level as I was, and, you know, managing a large team. I was pretty good about managing my stress. I've worked out, went to the gym, all the usual things, and I did a lot of purposeful delegation, empowerment of my team, which also can reduce stress as well. But nevertheless, there's still going to be some residual stress just from the day-to-day interactions, because when you're working in a bank in a high-powered situation, things happen, right? And you have to deal with them. And especially in my profession of cybersecurity, it's probably right at the top in terms of that stressful profession. And there's many examples of stats out there where cybersecurity professionals are turning to drugs, alcohol, and even suicide. And this is really bad for our profession, but it's a reality. So, you know, so this idea of being able to focus genuinely on my health, it meant having a regular protocol. And what I did is literally prioritized health over everything else. And this was important to me, and it should be the foundation of pretty much everything else that you do, because the reality is, without your health, nothing matters. And put yourself in this situation. When you have an injury of any sort, and it's preventing you doing the kind of day-to-day things that you want to do, you're not worried about making money or anything else. You're just thinking about how you can get better. So that becomes the number one thing. So you want to move that off the table, and you want to be as optimized as you can, as health, cognitively, physically. This is why if you kind of match both physical and mental fitness together, you get this kind of optimization effect. So meditation, non-negotiable twice a day, fit that in now. I'm doing 35 minutes, but if you only want to get started, do 20 minutes a day. There's a kind of focusing on your breath method. I use a mantra. You can chat to me in the comments about what technique you think would work best for you, and I'll advise you on some different options. And then strength training, you know, going to the gym. I go every day, and that's my core identity. And I've talked about this in other videos. Just because I go every day doesn't mean that I end up going every day, if that makes sense. So my intention is 7 days a week, but things get in the way, and if they do, that's fine. I just get back into it the next day, but I never go more than 3 days, that's my golden rule, without training at all. In fact, my body won't even allow it. It kind of starts aching in really unusual ways and prompts me to, like, you should be going to the gym. So that was a huge benefit, being able to focus on my health and apply that on a regular basis. Part of that health regime, by the way, is walking along a beach, which is why I chose to live in an environment that allowed me to focus on my health as well. Living in Australia, and you know, I know not everybody's got that option, but you should seriously consider an environment that you're going to retire into, that living in every day is where you want to live every day. If it's a miserable environment, yeah, or it's in the city or whatever, and there's plenty of places around the world, by the way, you can live really cheaply now for low tax. So you should seriously consider about where could I live in the world, which means I could live on less money. And there's lots of countries around the world now offering these kind of golden tickets, golden passports, golden work card visas that allow you to come to their country and, you know, live much cheaper. Now, for me, you know, Dubai was one of those countries that would have been an option, you know, having come out of the corporate world. You know, it would have been a brilliant tax efficient place for me. But because I'd placed health and well-being at the very top of my agenda, then that was never going to be an option, because then that was all about the money rather than the environment. And for me, health and well-being and the climate that you get where I live on the kind of east coast of Australia was far more important in terms of my hierarchy of needs. So we need to think about that, and that placement of where you finally want to live after the big corporate job will be an important part of your important decision-making process. So what things haven't worked out so well? There are a few things. I could tell you that loneliness is probably one of the biggest factors. You know, I don't have as much physical kind of day-to-day interaction with people. I'm okay with that, but it is a factor. So I make the effort. I certainly spend a lot of time with my wife, and we have those open communications, and we're spending time with each other, and we do go out to different festivals and different community events. But that is a factor, and if you're the sort of person that has the need to be with other people, then I think that will be an impact, and you should seriously consider that. There are physical communities that, I've talked about setting up in the area that I live for like business and health and all sorts of things. But you know what? I've never really got around to doing it. So I wonder whether that is a real priority for me or not. So anyway, but there's definitely an effect of not spending time with people. I think the other thing as well is, even though I've chose this proximity to living in Australia, I was living in Singapore previously. So it's quite a buzzy environment, the city environment. And I do kind of miss that as well to some degree. I do miss that kind of pace of life. I'm quite a high energy person. And even though I've, kind of semi-retired, if you want to call it that, I still miss that buzz. And I'd be lying to myself if I think I didn't. But I have to say, the longer I'm not in it, that less of that is a factor. The other big one, of course, is you just don't have the same money. There were months I could look at my bank account and it was going up and up and up, far more than I could spend it. And this is despite having an apartment that cost $13,000 a month to rent in Singapore. So you can only imagine the sort of money I was earning to be able to pay for that, and not being able to spend it each month. Don't forget, in Singapore as well, you have a lower rate of tax, tops out at about 22%. So you get to keep more of what you earn. And I'll talk more about tax efficient locations in another video, but that's definitely something I advise everybody do for at least a short space in their career. And in fact, I've advised about 4 or 5 people to do exactly that. And they said it's some of the best decisions that they've ever made. One of them was an entrepreneur, 2 of them were already in a career and they're living there. They were just able to apply some degree of flexibility to where they live, and they're reaping the rewards. They might not do it forever, but they'll do it for a period of time to really stack up their savings. I was fortunate enough, by the way, to be living in Singapore during the COVID time. Although the restrictions were quite severe, it was an opportunity to save money in a high income job. So that became a huge benefit for me as well. So you'll definitely miss that income coming in. In fact, living in Singapore, we did, in our early few years, kick into this kind of expat lifestyle, which is, very fabulous. You're having brunches, champagne brunches and lunches out and barbecues. After a couple of years of doing that, we were like, we're out of this, it's ridiculous. We were spending pretty much everything that we were earning just to kind of live this ridiculous expat lifestyle. And I would never advocate you do that. You've got to find ways to kind of dip in and out of it, but to find your own clique of friends, maybe in fitness or something else, that means that you don't get trapped into that. So money is definitely different, and you do have to think more frugally, but I will honestly say, if you've done all the proper planning before leaving the corporate role, and you've got to do this, I would say at minimum 18 months out, but I would give yourself a much longer leeway. If you're only 35 or 40 and you do want to retire early, there's some really good things that you need to stack up in time to be able to do that, and you can accelerate some of those things with AI. And I talk a lot about that in various downloads. If you want to have a look on my website, darrenargyle.com, you'll see bags of stuff on there that will help you, get a head start in this space. So the money side of things, definitely a challenge, but I always work on the basis that I want to do these certain things, so I'll find ways to do those certain things by finding opportunities to earn more income. By the way, you do not want to be filling all your time with earning too much, trying to chase the dollar just so you can do more things, because buying things is a kind of fool's errand. You don't want to be going out buying the big flashy cars and trying to keep up with the Joneses, because that's going to result in you going back to where you were before and then depending on like a corporate salary. And you don't want that kind of dependency. You want to seriously think about how you're going to reduce those costs. Travel is more limited as well. This is the other thing about picking a good environment though. You can choose an environment where traveling locally is best. We've got some of the most beautiful beaches in the world on our doorstep. So, we can travel up and down the coast each day, as far as north as the Gold Coast and right down to Sydney to some of the most beautiful places that you'll ever see in the world. So because of that, we're less limited. But those big kind of international holidays, they stop for now. Who knows, in the future we might decide to prioritise them again, but that does change. So you kind of have to get the realistic about, you know, what those big holidays that you used to spend on, like the big Maldives trip and all those are probably going to stop. We've now started to focus more on experiences where we can, you know, travel over to Bali, for example, and have a less expensive. And there's plenty of small little islands and locations that you can explore around the world that are just not going to cost you the earth. And quite honestly, whenever we go to some of these places that are off the beaten track with less tourists there, they tend to be a lot better. I don't know about you, but how many times have you gone to one of these kind of iconic places and you get the Instagram picture and then the reality? And the reality is you've got all these people fighting for positions. They take the snap and then they just walk off. You want to be kind of living the experiences rather than just snapping the experiences. So yeah, so that's a run through of where I am, 500 days in. On the whole, very happy with where I've landed. And there's lots of opportunities still coming in now. I think what it does force you to do is to seriously think about what do you want to be spending your time on. And you kind of get into the habit of spending it in a much more efficient way because you don't have the obligation of the big corporate job. And that makes you think differently. So the longer you're away from that corporate job where you've kind of got this drug dependency on this big salary coming in, that definitely changes everything. I've certainly done videos on fitness, and don't believe that I'm saying it all for 50s. You need to be starting some of those protocols in your 30s. So really start on those as well, because you lose muscle at something like 3 to 5% every decade, and when you get to 50, it's like, you know, you get another 15%, and you'll never get that back. Please like, subscribe, and if there's anything that you want to hear about specifically, then just drop a note in the comments and we'll start the conversation. I'll give you some advice and guidance. I've got spreadsheets for tracking expenses, playbooks, and a bunch of other things. I'll put some of those down in the description area in the comments section, and you can just download those at your will and make use of them. Darren, out.